The legend goes like this. A silk scarf floating down through the air lands on the edge of a Damascus blade. The silk does not stop. It does not catch. It parts, cut through by its own weight, by the touch of steel so sharp the fabric never knew it was there. That story, specifically, is almost certainly myth. A beautiful exaggeration passed down through centuries of wonder and fear. But strip away the poetry, and what remains is harder to dismiss. These blades were real. Swords and knives forged hundreds of years ago, covered in patterns that look like flowing water frozen into steel. Patterns that form naturally, not painted, not engraved, from the metal itself, and tests on surviving examples confirm what their reputation claimed. They were sharper than any blade made in Europe at the time, tougher, more flexible. They could hold an edge that would shatter a European sword, and they did it with a chemistry and a microstructure we are still working to fully recreate today. This is Damascus steel, a material so extraordinary it became legend, and then, sometime around the year 1800, the knowledge of how to make it vanished. Here is what makes a Damascus blade different. Start with the surface. Those flowing, ladder-like bands are not decoration. They are called Muhammad's ladder or the rose pattern, depending on the smith. And they form because the steel itself is banded. Layers of different crystal structures locked together at a microscopic scale. Zoom in and you see it. Light regions of soft, iron-rich metal and dark lines of iron carbide, cementite, a compound so hard it is almost ceramic. The carbon content is around 1.5%, sometimes higher. That is enormous. Modern high-carbon tool steel sits closer to 1%. Damascus steel pushed the metal to the edge of what iron can hold before it becomes too brittle to forge. And yet, it did not shatter. The banding gave it flexibility. The carbides gave it hardness. Together, they produced a blade that could be sharpened to a keener edge than anything Europe was forging in the same era and keep that edge through impacts that would ruin softer steel. The blades were made across the Islamic world, Persia, Syria, India, but the name comes from one city, Damascus. Not because the steel was smelted there, it was not. Damascus was a crossroads, a market. The place where the raw material arrived and where the greatest bladesmiths turned it into weapons that became famous enough to name the metal itself. That raw material was called Wootz, crucible steel, smelted in South India and Sri Lanka, possibly as early as the 6th century before Christ. Bloomery furnaces packed with iron ore, charcoal, and wood, sometimes specific wood, sometimes leaves from particular plants. The ore melted into small ingots, each about the size of a hockey puck, weighing maybe 2 kilograms. Those ingots were traded west, overland through Persia, by sea to the Arabian Peninsula, eventually to Damascus, where smiths who had spent lifetimes learning the temperament of this exact metal would forge it into blades. The forging was everything. Wootz is hyper-eutectoid steel, too much carbon to behave like normal iron. Heat it wrong, and the carbides grow coarse and the blade cracks. Forge it at the right temperature, and those carbides align into bands. The surface gets etched with acid after polishing, and the pattern emerges, because the soft iron etches darker than the hard carbide lines. The result was a blade covered in flowing patterns that proved its ancestry. You could not fake it. You could not paint it on. The pattern was the steel, and for more than 1,000 years, that steel was unmatched. Then it disappeared. No one knows exactly when the last true Damascus blade was forged. The production declined slowly through the 1700s. By 1800, maybe 1820, smiths in the Middle East were still making swords, but the metal coming out of the forges had changed. The patterns were faint, irregular, or gone entirely. The steel was softer, inferior, and no one could explain why. The smiths were using the same techniques their masters had taught them, but the Wootz itself was different, weaker, wrong, and within a generation, the knowledge of how to make proper Damascus steel was gone. For more than a century, historians argued about what happened. Some blamed the British East India Company. When European powers colonized South Asia, traditional smelting operations were disrupted. Trade routes collapsed. The small, artisanal bloomeries that had produced Wootz for over 2,000 years simply stopped. But that does not explain why no one could restart it. Ore was still available. Smiths still knew how to forge. So what was missing? The leading theory today is that the ore itself was the secret, and no one knew it. Modern analysis of historical Damascus blades shows trace elements that do not appear in most iron: vanadium, molybdenum, chromium, impurities that came from specific deposits in India, possibly a single region, possibly even a single exhausted mine. Those trace elements, present in concentrations of just a few hundredths of a percent, changed everything. Vanadium, especially, appears to drive the formation of the carbide bands. Add it to modern high-carbon steel, and the banding appears. Remove it, and even with perfect forging technique, you get a blade that looks wrong, flat, patternless. But the smiths never knew vanadium existed. It was not discovered as an element until 1830. They did not test their ore for chemistry. They simply used the ingots that came from the same suppliers their fathers and grandfathers had used. And when those sources changed or ran out or got replaced by ore from a different region, the steel failed and no one understood why. There is a second theory, that the process was kept deliberately secret and that secrecy killed it. Smiths in Damascus did not write manuals. They taught apprentices by demonstration, by feel, by years of watching. When those smiths died without passing the knowledge on, or when colonial disruption broke the chain of masters and students, the process went with them. Both explanations are probably true. The ore changed, the trade routes collapsed, the smiths aged and died, and the new generation never learned the critical details that had never been written down because everyone assumed they always would be remembered. By the mid-1800s, Damascus steel was a legend, and the blades that survived were museum pieces locked behind glass, too precious to melt down and analyze. For more than 100 years, no one on Earth knew how to make it. In 1996, two men decided to try. John Verhoeven, a metallurgist and professor emeritus at Iowa State University, and Alfred Pendray, a master bladesmith who had spent decades trying to recreate historical forging techniques. Pendray had managed to produce faint patterns in high-carbon steel, but nothing close to the flowing, dramatic bands of a real Damascus blade. So Verhoeven brought science. They started with the hypothesis that trace elements were key. Pendray began adding carefully measured amounts of vanadium to his steel, around 0.05% by weight, and forging the ingots the way descriptions of Wootz production suggested. Low heat, slow cooling, hours of patient hammering. And the patterns came back, not faint, not irregular, bold, flowing bands that looked like the historical examples. They had done it, not by finding ancient ore, not by rediscovering a lost manuscript, but by reverse engineering the chemistry and mechanics until the steel behaved the way the old smiths said it should. Verhoeven and Pendray published their findings in 1998. They had proven that vanadium was essential and that given the right recipe, Damascus steel could be made again. But they had also proven something else, that the smiths who forged these blades for over 1,000 years never knew the chemistry. They worked by tradition, by inherited technique, by the behavior of metal they trusted but did not scientifically understand. And then, in 2006, the story got stranger. A team of German researchers at the Technical University of Dresden, led by materials scientist Marianne Reibold and physicist Peter Pofler, put a fragment of a 17th-century Damascus saber under a transmission electron microscope. They were looking at the carbide structures, trying to understand what made the bands so uniform. What they found, at a scale measured in nanometers, was something that should not appear in any blade forged in a coal fire by a man with a hammer. Carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires, structures that modern materials science discovered in the 1990s. Structures that labs today grow in clean rooms with plasma torches and controlled atmospheres. Structures with extraordinary strength and flexibility, formed naturally in Damascus steel by a process no one alive in the 1600s could have described, because the science to see them would not exist for another 350 years. The trace elements in the Wootz, combined with the specific forging temperature and the slow cooling cycles, created conditions where carbon atoms assembled themselves into these nanoscale structures. The smiths never saw them, never tested for them, but they were there, woven into the microstructure of every blade, giving Damascus steel a toughness that seemed almost supernatural to anyone who fought against it. Pendray and Verhoeven had rediscovered how to make the patterns. Reibold and Pofler discovered why the blades were so good. Here is the thing that should keep you awake. Damascus steel was not lost because it was magic. It was lost because it was ordinary. It was a trade good, produced by workers who did not write papers, forged by smiths who learned by apprenticeship, not textbooks. And when the chain of production broke, when the right ore ran out, when the trade routes shifted, when the smiths died and the colonial economy moved on, it was just gone. No catastrophe. No single enemy burning the library, just the slow, silent collapse that happens when knowledge lives only in hands and memory, and those hands stop working. Think about how much we have lost the same way. Medieval stained glass, where we still do not know what gave certain reds their depth. Roman concrete that could set underwater and last 2,000 years. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that burned on water, used by the Byzantine Navy for 300 years and then forgotten so completely we are still guessing at the formula. These were not fringe technologies. They were strategic assets, military secrets, infrastructure that empires depended on, and every single one of them vanished because the people who knew how to make them did not write it down, or wrote it in code, or kept it secret, or simply assumed their children would carry it forward. And then the world changed, and the children never learned. Damascus steel teaches the same lesson. A technology does not have to be complicated to be lost. It just has to be undocumented. It has to depend on a specific material source that no one realizes is unique. It has to live in a network of people and trade routes and unspoken expertise, so that when one link breaks, the whole chain collapses. And maybe most important, it shows how much our ancestors knew that we give them no credit for. We imagine them as primitive, superstitious, working by trial and error with no understanding of what they were doing. And then we find carbon nanotubes in a sword forged 350 years before anyone knew nanotubes could exist. We find metallurgy that took modern science 2 centuries to reverse engineer. We find proof, cut into the steel itself, that they got there first. By a different path, maybe, without our vocabulary, but they got there. We did not invent these things. We reinvented them, and the only reason we think of them as lost is because we assumed progress moved in one direction. That newer always means better. That anything made in the past could be made again easily if we ever cared to try. Damascus steel says otherwise. It says that knowledge is fragile, that expertise can die in a single generation, that a civilization can reach an extraordinary height and then step backward into ignorance so completely that their descendants will argue for centuries over whether the achievement was ever real. We know how to make Damascus steel now, mostly. We understand the chemistry. We can replicate the patterns. We have seen the nanotubes. But every blade we make today is a copy, reverse-engineered from fragments, built with knowledge the original smiths never had and techniques they never used. We can recreate it, but we cannot recover it. The unbroken line of masters teaching apprentices, stretching back 2,000 years, that is gone. The specific mines in southern India that produced ore with exactly the right trace elements, exhausted or forgotten or never identified. The trade routes, the markets, the voices of the smiths explaining why this ingot felt right and that one did not. Silent. What remains are the blades themselves, evidence that for more than a millennium, people we never named, in workshops we cannot locate, using chemistry they could not articulate, made something we are only now beginning to fully understand. And that when that knowledge finally slipped away, we did not even notice it was gone until it was too late to ask the last person who remembered. If you want to see what else we have lost and found again, the next video is about Viking navigational crystals, stones that could locate the sun through clouds, used for 300 years, then forgotten, and finally proven to work in a lab in 2011. You will not believe how simple it was, or how long it took us to remember.